name's Break. I do drum and bass and various other music production for about the last 15 years. Basically what I thought I'd do today is just show you a couple of drum and bass tracks. One of them's Steam Train, which I put out on Symmetry, which is my label, about a year ago. And the other track's something that hasn't come out yet, but I picked two different tracks. One that's been lashed, heavily compressed, all the kind of drum and bass bad stuff, and then a kind of clean, safe, more kind of laid back and less pushed sort of mix, just to show you the two different ways you can actually get a good mix and you don't have to smash everything. So what I thought I'd do, I'll start with Steam Train. I'll give you a quick playthrough and then just go through some of the tracks, shows you how I built it, and just what some of the individual tracks are doing and plugins and stuff like that. So I'll give you a quick blast of the tune and then we'll check out how it was sort of done really.
See what you can do. You can listen to it at home. Basically, how this track started, I found this record called Memories of Steam in a charity shop for £1, and it looks pretty old. I think it was from the sort of period where stereo was pretty exciting, so everyone was recording things that go left to right. And that's like a big part of what I did a lot, is just trawling through charity shops and just finding random vinyls for like 50p or £1, and you can't even listen to them, you just take them home and see what's on there, but I assume there'd be some sort of train steamy sort of noises on there. And that's kind of how I started. I just got a load of stuff off there, sort of chopped it up, went through and kind of just thought, no one's really put Steam Train sounds in a drum and bass tune. So for stuff like this, so weird clanking Steam sounds, I've sort of chopped loads of them up to sort of pepper the track with. And that was just kind of a bed to start with, because if you just have a beat in the middle of nothing, it's just a sort of beat and there's not much atmosphere or kind of situation for that beat to be in. And what I do really with my process is I throw everything into Wavelab, which is a Steinberg program, which I've always used, which is just great for chopping up sounds, sort of sorting out your samples. What I show you, which I do a lot, is just, you can use this, it's great for declicking. And there was lots of clicks, obviously it's from vinyl, and if you get lots of samples from vinyl, you're going to get clicks everywhere, which can be good, and if you want that kind of crusty sort of vinyl sound, you leave the clicks in. But I just found a little beat here which has got a click in, and just show you what I do to kind of get rid of clicks. And I'll do this with most breaks that I sample, there's always clicks or little noise and things you don't want. It's hard to hear always, but the more that you listen, and you may not even hear the click until you made this beat, you compress the hell out of it and suddenly all the noise comes up and there's a little click every snare. So for example on this snare, there's an annoying click and you can just about see it from here. If you zoom in a little bit more, you sort of see this click here, and that's what we're not really wanting. and I just draw these out with the pencil, and you just go in and literally just draw it out. And you can use declicking software, and sometimes I use that when you can't see the click, but usually that will do the job, and that click's gone. If you undo it, you can hear the clicks there, and that click's gone. So that's what I've kind of done with all the beats. I just chuck them in here, go through, sort of check out all the audio. This is a much better view for me than like Logic or a lot of other, I think SoundForge is pretty good as well, but to get a good waveform display, you can see in and zoom in really close on these to sort of see exactly what's going on the actual wave. So I just use this to clean things up first, and that's what I did with all those steam train sounds, chuck them in here. And then usually my next kind of port of call is recycle. And all my beats I generally do in recycle. And as a little side note, it's basically, once you do it in recycle, I load it into Logic as an EXS sampler format, and you've got all your slices on individual hits. This was the beat that I originally made, and I actually put this through some outboard. I got an 1176 compressor, which people don't always use for drums, but it's got a very chunky, sort of bright sound. And I just bought it, so I thought, what the hell, I've got to use it on something. And again, I'll just use recycle because it gives you, I think, a bit more control over each slice. And a big thing that I'm into, which people sometimes miss when they're chopping audio, is just to leave the front of each hit. So if you chop everything right on the line, it's just a snare coming out of nowhere. There's no like pre-hit on the drummer's hand coming into that. And that's why you'll get these beats that just sound quite computery, because there's no natural sort of movement and pre-hit in the drum. So when I use this, you just, you've got your individual slices. This is a really old program. It's been around since before I was making tunes. This beat, because I've kind of done it already, is ultra clean, and you can see that all the transients now have been sort of re-chopped down. But I'd always recommend to leave a little bit of space at the front of your hit. Don't directly chop it right on the line or on the zero, because you don't get that little pre-hit in. And so once you've chopped it up in here, if you want, you can leave things like this, but usually I'll get every little bit so that you can delete the bits you don't want if you don't want these little hats, and you've got control over every hit. Another little side point that people sometimes miss out, which does work, is there's a section in here with transient and sort of EQ section. I generally don't really use the EQ. I think that's the wrong number of bars. 4 bars. Or is it 2 bars? And you can actually get some quite good effects using these. There's like a few different presets which just instantly give you a sound on your beat. So if you want it really smacky, quite different to that. And that kind of compresses every hit rather than overall compression on everything. So it's a little cheap way to sometimes get everything punchy before you've even brought it into your tune. You're like, I could have had it like this, but now I've just got it like that. Oops. So that's just another little thing I do quite often, just to sort of beef up the beats before you've started. And subsequently you can throw, for a long time I've thrown every sound that I used into recycle, because then it's a Rex file and you can just drag that straight into a sampler, and it's the quickest way of getting something into a Logic sampler. So if I go back to the tune, I'll just sort of show you where these things have landed up. And to be honest, it was a little while back, so I can't exactly remember my process of where I started and where I finished, but from what I remember, it was getting these steam sounds in, and I did work on this beat for a long time to just get the beat how I needed it. I'll play the beat, which is just basically these 3 tracks. Now what I've ended up doing with this one, which I was kind of surprised I'd done it when I went back to look at this, the whole way through this tune, that beat which you heard in Recycle is actually low cut using this EQ here to 250 hertz all the time. And I think I started with it normal, but often the low part of a break, because it's live recording, you've just got a lot of weird low stuff that's hard to control. And once you start adding a lot of sub bass to things, this is where you get flapping on your low end. So I think I made that decision sort of early on to just cut that at 250 so that you're mainly just getting the top end of that beat. So if you hear it on its own, it's a lot more tinny and thin. And what I've gone about is just layering a kick and snare underneath that to beef up that beat. So that's with the snare and then the kick. So the kick's doing a lot of the sort of heavy work there, and as everyone, it's a mission to get good kick samples and to make good kicks.
How much processing has gone to the kick and snare?
Not as much as sometimes, actually, because it does take me a lot of effort sometimes to get it sounding good. I'll run through the plugins I've processed the kit with, basically, quickly. There's actually quite minimal on here. It's a weird kind of EQ, which I'll find out what that's doing, really. One side point before I go on is like, I've fallen into this trap for years, sitting with a kick on its own, EQing it all day, and it's just irrelevant to the rest of the beat. So it is good where you can to sort of EQ things in the mix, so that it's all comparative to what you're mixing it with.
Do you know before you've added like loads of additive EQ?
Sorry, speak up a touch.
Before you've added loads of like additive
Yeah.
EQ, have you had to sort of clean up the kick first?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I find you can find that 150 to 250 region is quite dangerous.
It is. It's kind of boxy and sort of boomy. I mean, sometimes, like I said, in that Wavelab program, I might load up the kick first, fade it out a bit early if it's too long, or even if it needs a bit of EQ first, you can do that in there.
And I know that's quite a subjective kind of question, but I'm just saying in general, do you find yourself doing quite a lot of processing on kicks?
It's more find a good kick. That's the thing.
Minimal amount of process.
That's it. You want to just start off with a head start. If you just have this sort of crappy, flappy kick that you're going to try and turn into an amazing kick, you're just wasting time, basically. So I'll just load up 1,000 kicks, just hit down, 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 just go through this list, pick out 10 good ones. And then again, at this point now, maybe go through those 10 different kicks with the beat you've got and see which one suits it or fits with it best. And this one's called Select Kick because I'd selected loads of kicks and just this was one of the best ones I'd found at the time. So I don't know, yeah, we'll see if that EQs. It's kind of reshaping this mid that's a little bit lacking. The low boost there I'm a little bit confused by, but obviously at the time I was wanting some oomph straight away. Got no idea, I haven't used the fat EQ I thought for 10 years, but there's a little one on there. And that's just knocking out a little bit of 2K. From looking back at this earlier, I mean the Pultec EQ that I've used here, this is doing the real nice bit, and it's actually only one boost at 300 Hertz. But that's just adding, even with this plugin on its own, which is a UAD one, but quite a few other people make the Pultec EQ or similar version, it just adds some nice warmth anyway.
Do you find that when you sometimes EQ, say, a drum sound, if you find a nice sound, but then it's like some rogue harmonics, if you take them harmonics out, like take the boxings out, you know, maybe export it down and then re-add them using EQ, do you find that?
Sometimes, yeah.
Because, yeah.
So yeah, we can just hear this one. There's another logic problem that a lot of you might have, which is if you've got sidechains on a channel, it will just overload every time you play it, so you've got to click off and click on again, which is highly jarring. So you can hear without that, there's like a weird hole in the kick. And compared to the snare now, you're like, the kick sounds a bit sort of hollow and thin. So that's just kind of filling out a bit of that hollow area that actually, like you're saying, is a problem area, 300, 200 in kicks. But sometimes you just got to put it in and deal with it later to get the kick you want to start with. And actually, that limiter's not even doing anything, so it almost may as well not be on there. Yeah, that's literally not doing anything, so I don't know why I had that. It may have been louder before. and I've just kept that level at 0 because it does seem like it's peaking, but it's probably the EQ changes. So again, actually, there's not much on that kit. The main work was done by picking the right kit to start with.
Do you change your start points a lot?
Sometimes. This is again why I like to put everything into the sampler, because once you've got it in the sampler, you can then tweak these start points in here. So you can see I had all these other kits before that I've gone through, and a lot of them are pretty good ones because I've picked them out. And so you can just sit there with the MIDI, have that kick copying the beat, and then just move that note up and down through all the different kicks, because it's so much nicer to hear it with the full beat than just trying to pick the kick on its own, because it's all about the mix of the beat. So that's often how I do it, load up sort of 20 kicks, and then you can just get that layering right. Another thing that's quite important is the pitch and the phasing, because if you're layering up, this is often why I don't like layering kicks. The kick within the original beat might phase or clash with the kick layer that you're putting in. And a good trick that can be used with that is either nudging your kick slightly forward, which you can do with this delay here, which isn't like echo delay, but it's just start point delay. And so it will just be like a fraction of a second later where that sound starts every time it's triggered. And sometimes you just sit here, go through those numbers up and down a little bit, and you'll hear if I do it now. Starts to flam and to flap. But sometimes it will be like that to start with, and you can bring it back in because it's a little bit too early, or there's a bit of a start point on it, there's a little gap. And that just can be a good trick to get everything sorted without having to go in and change every single kick. So that's a lot of why I like MIDI, because you can control all your hits with just the sampler or with the channel strip on the side. Checking out the snare, really not much on this. A small bit of EQ. These would probably be rings, little doo kind of little rings. I'll see if I can hear them now. And getting those out early is a good thing, but I've spent many years doing hundreds of these little dips and spikes, and every time you do a dip, you're going to create another spike somewhere else, just due to sort of EQ and the quality of the EQ. And the fab filter is good to work with, this one, but it does create problems sometimes if you go too nuts with all these scoops. And sometimes it's better to not scoop, because you will just create more problems. But I'll give it a go, see what it improved. This is Logic fun. Take everything off. So yeah, you can hear this like sort of note. There's like a tone in the snare. And if you boost these up, you'll kind of hear that tone. That's what I'll do, is go through with a boost, and you can sort of hear that little boop that you don't really want, maybe. You might want it, so it's all subjective. But I'm just taking a bit of that out, and possibly this one's a bit more ringy. That's this little, which you can hear when it's flat. And now just every time I hear that snare, all you can hear is that. For me, so I'm like, no, I can't live with that. It's got to go. Now it's a bit more dead, a bit more dry, and it's usually the room sound in the beat that's been played in the real room, or it's something else on the drum kit ringing that creates this. And that is a good reason why splitting up your drums into separate tracks can really help. Because if we were trying to EQ that out of the snare on a whole beat, you'd then be taking that out of the kick, which might not have that ring. And again, if you've got all of those little dips on your beat, you're going to have these troughs and peaks, and it could create a lot of nightmares with just bad EQing, basically. This dynamic EQ, this is great for, I think this is adding some punch. Let's see what this is doing. No, so that's doing the opposite. This is actually scooping out the harshness. And you hear that it's like an obvious difference with this one. So that's basically scooping out, what we're saying here, that's about 4,000K, which is just that harsh high mid that basically just hurts your ear the louder you turn it up. It's the sort of harsh, kind of snappy area, which you need, but sometimes it's just going to make your whole track sound harsh and kind of tinny.
Charlie, why would you use a dynamic EQ over a normal EQ?
Right, that's a good point. I mean, on something like this, you could use an EQ because I've already separated that snare on its own. If this was a whole drum beat, you might just be able to tune into that frequency that's doing that. Let's say it's the snare, and actually this dynamic EQ would just attack that snare at that frequency without attacking other frequencies. And it also has attack and release settings on it, which I've got very quick. So it's just getting the front of that snare, which is mainly, the attack is what's harsh. It's less the tail that's harsh, but it's that first initial hit that's a bit spiky, basically. And I'm going to come back to all this spikiness later, because that's a thing that I'm quite obsessed with, is removing this spikiness. So that's just a good thing. You know, you can use EQ, and often I will do scoops around this kind of 4, 5, 6, 7K area, which is often that spiky sort of harsh area. But I like that, you know, dynamic EQs gives it a slightly more natural, less constantly scooped out sound. It just scoops out when you want it to. And I've got the release very fast, so effectively the EQ is just going like this, really quick. It's not just on the whole time, it's just doing a little dip, and you'll see it on that display when it does it. So it's just a very quick little snap down. And in a way that'll just keep the sort of sound of the snare more even without actually having a big gaping hole in it all the time. And this is just, again, now what I'm doing is putting back in that treble after I've softened it off with this sort of analog EQ from Waves. And now that it's smoother and you've taken that attack down, so you can hear, if I put on this EQ without that, it's just going to be even spikier and brighter, which we don't really want. So it's nice that it boosts it, but it's a bit harsh. So this before it, you're getting a softer, but actually almost brighter sound, because your ear's focusing less around these frequencies and kind of more up here. And so that applies to almost everything in all mixing, is just softening things and then boosting them up afterwards once they've been kind of addressed, and the attack and releases maybe are smooth, or vice versa. You might want to make everything really spiky and punchy and really kind of sharp. But generally it seems to always be the other way for me, trying to reduce that. So you put these back together, and you know, this has taken a long time, this beat, just to get those sort of levels right. And the problem with this process is it's all kind of round in circles, and what I'm going to show you is how, in a minute, how kind of the master has got quite a lot of stuff on it on this track. And a fair bit of this processing I may have done 10, 20 hours later, once I've actually come to the master, and I start, you know, I hadn't even noticed that the snare was harsh, possibly until I'd made the tune. So I might have come back later on and actually thought I need to put this little dynamic EQ in later. It might not have been the first thing I noticed. And when I get to the master later, you'll just see how the master dramatically changes the sound of the track. So that's roughly the sort of beat. And the bass is quite a big thing in this track. And I made this track with a sort of different technique, which I sort of discovered at that stage. I got a new studio, not the studio I'm in now, but it was an older studio, and it was the first time I'd really, in my career, just been able to crank my speakers up full blast. And I had some Mackie speakers, which a lot of speakers will have it, but they'll have a little light that comes on when the speaker's actually clipping, when you just turn it up too loud and the speaker's like, no, that's as much as I can take. And that's like an indication of just that something in the music is too loud or too powerful or too transient, that's too punchy and snappy, that's hurting the speaker basically. And so I just sat with this tune with the bass and drums for a long time, watching this light with the speaker on full blast, just left it turned up super loud, and you just start to notice little things in the track that are causing that speaker to peak. And that will happen on a sound system in a club, because that's what the system will be like your speakers. It's going to have a limiter, and it's going to have a sort of pain threshold as much as it can take. So really, if your tune is filling that up and not setting off that light as soon as possible, you've probably got a louder overall track on speakers. So what I did was really just have the bass and drums playing together and spent a long time tweaking little things to try and work out what was setting off that red light. As often it's bass, but often it will be one little double up or a layer where your kick and bass hit at the same time, or even a little vocal stab that's really harsh. It can set off this light. And that's kind of almost why I've done a lot of kind of weird stuff on this track,
to sort of stop that light happening, which is a technique I use now still, because it really shows you. You can sit with levels and meters and all of these things in the computer, but just hearing it on speakers, and in reality, you wouldn't see that light was setting off your limiter necessarily in the computer. So I'll give a quick blast of the bass, and I'm going to explain how I made the bass, because it's a kind of a little bit of a mission to do the bass on this track. We're actually on, this is another thing I'll get to, this is an older version of the arrangement that I did, and after playing the track out a few times and sending it to a few people, I noticed the intro was too short, and I hadn't really made enough of the steam sounds. So I just copied the whole track over here, which sometimes I find easier to do because it keeps your original arrangement there. You can pull little edits and things out that you like from there and drag them onto the new version. And that can be a really good technique because you can just sort of see what you had and not kind of have to keep opening up the old version and referring back to that. So that's why I've got two kind of songs on the same arrangement here. And also with Logic, when you've got a lot of automation data, trying to move that, sometimes you get problems, so I just find it easier to copy it and sort of do another version, basically. So yeah, this is the correct version. So these are our bass tracks. Basically, we've got a main bass, and I'll quickly run through how I made that. It's using the EMU sampler, which I don't sadly have here today, and my one doesn't work, so I took these basses around my mate's house who's got one, and we just took a load of bass samples, some that I'd made on the Virus synth, some that were just samples from sort of packs or from just wherever, and with the sampler it's got mad filters, it's got effects that you don't really get in plugins that much these days, and just the fact that it goes into some hardware and there's converters on the actual plugs of the sampler that just has a sound. So a lot of people still today like to run their basses or any sounds into an EMU sampler, do some mad stuff to it and then record it again. And I found a session earlier which was all these sessions from the EMU. This is the one that I used for one of the basses. Next one. So that's the little sound I've used in this one. And there's so much I haven't used, and all of these are great. So you're just recording, just on its own, just recording bass. You just have it all going on, just sitting around there fiddling. It doesn't matter what you make because you're going to chop it all up later. So you just record bass for a couple of hours, tweaking things live. And just trying to get mad sounds out of it, and then sort of with that approach that you're going to chop all these up later and try and use the best bits. And so I'll just go through and make loads of mad stuff. Things like that, you're just not really you're going to struggle sometimes to get that out of a computer because you can just hear the madness of that filter is a sort of EMU filter, which a lot of people have tried to replicate, and it just has quite a 90s drum and bass sound to it, basically, and a lot of the guys who made the tunes that I liked growing up, everyone was using EMUs, so in my head that is the kind of bass you want to hear often, but it's laborious and it's going to take a lot of effort to do that, which is why sometimes doing just a session one day of making bass is a lot more productive than trying to make a tune and get this bass in your tune out of nowhere, which I do a lot, and you just think, why have I not prepared? I've not got anything to work with. So that's definitely a good tip for everyone, is just sort of prepare before you go into a session, and if you've got a folder of great sounds, you're probably going to get a great tune. And if you start with nothing, you're just going to be banging your head against the wall all day.
Do you know when you're sampling bass notes, try and make sure that the whole frequency spectrum is covered from one to the end, so when you
as in what, different pitches of that bass?
No, I'm just saying, say you sample like one note of the bass, you try and cover the whole spectrum, so then when you go in, you can take it out.
Absolutely, yeah, that definitely helps. So if you've got all that top end and that distortion in it, if you don't want it, you can just filter that off and have the sub.
Yes.
But if you just sample subs, it's going to be hard to get that grit and distortion just out of the sub. And there are ways to do it, but again, using something like an EMU,
or any kind of equipment that you can just get some noise or some dirt out of, basically. Getting that on your bass will give you so much more to work with when you bring it back into your track. Otherwise, you're just going to have a sine wave that doesn't really have much character or sort of noise on it. And that's we've tried. And actually, just even using the EMU, you're going to get noise from the cables and everything. And I love all that stuff because it just gives it character and a bit of realness. A kind of a soft synth with nothing on it. It's just purely digital and synthetic. And I try and avoid that where possible, really. So I've sort of chopped through some basses. I've thrown these into the EMU sampler. The Logic sampler. And this one's actually just one hit across all the keyboards. And like you were saying, this one did have stuff in it, but I've more or less filtered this down to either kind of sub-track. But you can still hear this tone in there that gives it a little bit of... It's not just totally sub, there's still some sort of body there.
So basically, it's a case of finding it, with everything in there rather than just layering afterwards. I mean,
it can be. It's literally just different strokes for different folks, but like that, for me, that technique is better because you've got stuff to work with, and if you don't want it, you can sack it off. But it's so much harder to get something out of nothing, really. So basically, this track is just sort of programmed in the MIDI, quite simple, just literally 2 notes. That's the main subline. And again, for me, with a lot of these things, MIDI I find has got a bit more groove. Some people think it's looser than audio because it's got information sending it to trigger those hits. But for everything I've worked with, I find it gives it a little bit of swing and a bit of liveness that most times I do audio tunes and it's just blocks of audio. I've got quite a few in here still, but there's something about MIDI that gives you, I don't know, a bit more groove basically, and you can just try that out for yourselves and see whether you prefer MIDI or audio. And there's lots of guys I know that do it all in audio and they make great tunes, so it's definitely not a rule, but that's just how I learned when I was, oh dear, it's a fire alarm. So yeah, basically then I've got this lead sound, which is the kind of main cutting bass. Which is pretty dirty. I think originally I made that on the Virus C, which is just a hardware outboard synth, which has got a lovely sound. It's pretty synonymous with drum and bass because a lot of guys have used it over the years, and it just has that kind of drum and bassy sound. And a big thing with this sound, I remember from the mix, was it just sort of sat in the middle, like bass often does because it's mono, and trying to get it to jump out in the tune to be like an exciting lead. I was explaining to someone outside what I generally do with basses, rather than having separate channels for each bass and copying them on top of each other, I just send them out to a bus auxiliary channel, which basically copies it itself anyway. So for example, with this one, it's going out to... Oh yeah, what, you're not seeing? Oh yeah, right, okay. Cut off the screen there. Got you. Nice. Yeah, that's annoying. Okay. So yeah, basically on here you can just load up a send and it'll give you a new track here, which you then have got that bass sound going to already. So on its own, this one. So instantly it doubles it up and it's twice as loud, so that kind of throws you off, but you're like, right, I've got to put some plugins on it. So this is a quick sort of without that thing and with it. And this is basically a distortion and reverb bus. It's just giving that little gritty edge. So on its own, it's basically doing this as a layer. And so that's just the high, kind of gritty, dirty stuff. And what I've done with this also is, yeah, I boosted the stereo section, which this Brainworks plugin is quite useful for. There's only a few that do this, where it gives you the mono and stereo EQs separately. And so you can boost out the kind of the high stuff to the sides of the bass, which gives it that width, which without that, it's all just sitting in the middle, and you can't really sort of pick it out in the mix as well, and the gritty stuff doesn't spread around to your ears as well.
So what sort of frequency do you start putting your stereo in your bass line?
With this one, I'm just going to have a look. I've low cut that to 80, but it sounds very much higher. Normally, it would be sort of quite high up, from I'd say about around sort of 1K upwards. So just kind of, yeah, pretty much this half of the spectrum, sort of. I always call it the sort of jump up frequency is basically 500 hertz. That's the kind of like cheap, kind of like tony bass you don't really want. So a lot of it is scooping that out, and that instantly gives you the grit up there because you're not hearing all of that stuff. And once you've done that, what I've also done here is widened it with a stereo imager. And this one just you can set to widen the high, so that is at 1000 hertz or 900, and you can see with this what it's doing in terms of the image here on that thing. So look how it was just totally pretty much in the middle before, and then this thing throws it out to the sides. It's very easy to use. You just literally turn up the width on whichever frequency you want. So now you can see there's just stuff happening out on the sides, which in the mix especially, it's not just going to be bass in the middle. That'll just give you space and sort of actually in the mix will make the bass sound much fatter, even though it's mainly top end.
Just quickly.
Yeah, sure.
How much do you worry about like mono capability?
Sorry, a little bit louder.
How much do you worry about mono capability for your tunes?
Right, it's definitely important for the low sub. And on this sub channel, I don't think I've done it because I think I may have done it beforehand, but using something like this plugin, which again is really good for that, this has got a thing called a mono maker, and you just click that on where it's on already, and you just roll that up to whatever frequency you want, and that will mono anything under that frequency, which they do a lot in mastering. When you take your track to mastering, they always mono everything under like 60 hertz or 40 hertz or something, just to make sure that the sub is in the middle. So even if you've missed that, you can do it afterwards, but you'll lose mono power in your mix if you don't do that. Some people do have stereo bass, and that can work really well, but 90% of the time I mono it, because in a club it's going to be a mono, often a mono system, or just a kind of, you're going to be standing by a mono speaker or whatever, and bass and mono just seem to be a pretty done, tried and tested method.
Yeah, so just quickly about like the top end rips though, they were really wide stereo.
Yeah.
So do you worry about them being mono capable as well?
Not particularly. I mean, again, a big thing for a lot of my career when I started off, it was all cutting to vinyl. And whenever I'd go to mastering sessions, I'd say to the engineer, what can I do to make it better? And they would say, bring in your stereo tops, because that actually sort of sets the cutting lathe. It makes it sort of trip out on the amplifiers. So for a long time, all my shakers, a lot of my top end was actually, all my tracks were quite mono sounding, but you will often get a better vinyl cut from that. But where everything's going digital more, these days, you can sort of slip in more stereo into your tracks, which I've been doing a lot more of in the past few years. And weirdly, this one cut to vinyl and sounded fine, and it was almost like I didn't really need to worry about that too much. But you don't really want a tambourine all the way on the right and a kind of shaker on the, I mean, you can do, but it's like they will lose level probably trying to master that to vinyl. So that's just something I've been aware of for years, but kind of as time's gone on with digital, everyone's like, hey, stereo, just max it out more. And you'll sort of find that, there's improvements that you're like, wow, I can't believe I didn't used to do that. I mean, in general, I'm not madly technical, so there'll be someone else who'll say to you like, you've got 4 dBs too much of width or something, but it is just literally like what sounds better, and you could turn that off and it sounds worse, and you turn it on and it sounds better, so it's job done really. So yeah, you can just hear that in the mix. What I'll just do really quickly is just loop that a little bit so we can just hear that going around. I'll turn it up a bit extra loud this channel because it's probably hard to hear these intricacies here.
quite muffled and kind of a bit sort of murky without that. So a lot of my basses, a lot of the time, I'm sending them to a bus and then basically distorting the top end. That is the main kind of gist of getting that kind of fizzy bass sound. And I'd imagine on this sub-channel there's some of that going on as well. We'll check out these buses here.
What did you use for a sub?
This was, let's have a look. I think that's one of those EMU basses. It's an EMU 808 basically. It's just an 808 bass, 808 kick that had been, I think, no, maybe not even looped. I don't know if it's a really long 808 or it might be a looped 808 kick, but it's pretty kind of standard tone. Annoyingly with this one I forgot to prepare this. There's one plug-in, this decapitator, that's not working. Say again? Bit of movement. It does, yeah, it seems kind of wobbly and there is, yes, on here I've got a very small LFO happening on that, which you'll see here is, that's actually what the bass was to start with, without the filter, which is quite cool anyway, but, and having a look at it, you can actually see there's automation on that LFO send moving as it's happening, yeah, so it kind of wobbles more on certain bits and comes down. So basically this is the filter that's getting sent to this LFO here, which is just set to go woo 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 woo, and then this is the amount that the filter gets sent to that LFO, and so it's just, yeah, it's actually moving as that's happening. And you can do lots of cool stuff with this, just sort of changing this speed as it's going. You'll get those different movements there. And that's how really a lot of my bass lines have been done, are just with this LFO and this filter in the sampler. Which you can probably, you can use with like, I don't know, Reactor or Contact. There's lots of other things where you can get that filter moving with the bass. But I just happen to like this one because it's kind of similar to the EMU sampler. So when I came, I used to just work on totally just a sampler and a computer and do it all in the sampler. So when I came onto Logic, I was just like, this is the closest thing to a sampler basically, like an EMU.